So even if you're not building a website that is built on this like very strict grid, it might even just be that your grid is one column wide and maybe two rows high. It's extremely handy to use CSS Grid for centering things. And we all know the jokes about how hard it is to center things in CSS. Well, Flexbox fixed most of that. And I think it's even easier in Grid to center all of your items. So let's actually first take a look at all the different properties. We actually have 6 properties that come along with being able to align things in Grid. We've got justify items and align items. We've got justify content and align content. And then we have align self and justify self. So really the way to understand, I think most people just sort of try one, and if it's the wrong one that they're looking for, they go for the other one. The way to remember it is that the justify ones are along the x-axis or the row axis, and the align items are along the column axis, so top to bottom. And unlike Flexbox, they don't switch, so you don't have to sort of remember where's my axis going. So let's start off. And what I recommend for doing this is not to come back to this video every single time, but the CSS tricks article has some really nifty here. These little articles or these little images will show you sort of what each of them do and what all the different properties do. So let's start you off here. I've actually made you a bunch of different items here, and I've given them a class of ITM, not item, just because I don't want the styling that I've given you as base styling in the style.css to play into our understanding of how this works. So first thing we want to do is let's go through the first one, the justify items and align items. So this is the actual items themselves. That's these divs or whatever the direct children are of the container. So let's go into here, and actually let's first put some color on it. So ITM, give it a background of white. Good. So we see how all of our items are, and we'll just go back up to our container and justify items, and let's say center. So what will that do? Ooh, so the default of justify items is stretch, and that will stretch them across the entire actual grid that we have. So here we are. This is the grid. It goes that far. But if we change that to center, you'll see that the actual item itself is only as wide as it needs to be. So if I were to take one of these and add something like Wes is cool, you'll see that that is only as large as it actually needs to be. If it went a little bit longer than that, you would see that it would indeed take up the entire width of the grid. But in our case, since we're just using some numbers here, or Wes is cool, it's only going to go as wide as the actual content is. So we similarly have start, which will bring you to the start, and we have end, which will bring you to the end. You can also interchange those with flex start as well, and flex end, because those were the values for Flexbox, but I think that it makes more sense just to use start and end. We had stretch. Let's see what else we got here. What were the justify items? Start, end, center, and stretch. So those are all the 4 possible options that you have there. So that's along, again, justify is along the x-axis, and then the align items, and that is, let's say, start. See if that does anything different. No, it doesn't. And that's because our rows don't have any height to them. So if we were to go into here and say grid template rows and repeat, 5 at 100 px high, you'll see that now our rows are 100 pixels high. And if we were to align them at the start, then they are at the top. Obviously, the end would go to the end. The center will go to the center, and the stretch will stretch them all the way across. So if you did want to perfectly center something, it is as simple as just saying center, center, and that will center exactly inside of that item. So super easy. Even easier, you can use the sort of CSS shorthand that we've got now, which is just called place items, and say center, center, and that will do your justify and your align in a single go. What is it yelling at me about here? Unknown property. Well, we're a cutting edge here, VS Code, and I know about it. So you do want to be careful about browser support for this. What I would recommend doing if you are using place items is to make sure that your auto prefixer will turn your place items into the equivalent justify and align. Let's do a little inspect element, open this up. See, if you open up your place items, you can see that it is just shorthand for these other two properties that we have. So again, justify on the x-axis, align on the y-axis. Anytime we're talking about items, we're talking about the actual items themselves. Now let's flip over to the align self and the justify self. Let's flip over to the justify content and the align content. So we'll go over here. Let's look at what Mr. Coyer has to say about this. Justify content. There we go. So the justify content, if the grid is not as wide as we could possibly want. So in our case, we're using FR units, and since it's going to go all the way across. But if I were to change this to, let's say 100 px, it actually, maybe it's got to go. Maybe we should just have 5 items. There we go. So now our grid, if we put a border around it, you see our grid is this wide, but I only have 5 columns that are 100 pixels each. So I've got all this extra space. And what do we do with that extra space? That is what justify content and align content answers. So again, justify is on the x-axis. Let's take a look at how that works. So say justify content, and I think start is the default. Yep. Again, we can do end. We can do center, and you see how it's centering itself. And then probably the two most helpful one, and these are mirrored in Flexbox, is space around. And what that will do is it will take each of our items. So here, let's bring this back to stretch just so we can visualize a little easier. There we go. And then it will take the extra space and put it in between each of the values that you have. And now you may be wondering, like, why is this not as big as this? And that's because space around will take all of the extra space and evenly divide it on either side of your column. So if you would not like these sort of sideline things here, we just say space between. And that will nix the left and the right, which is almost always what you want when you're trying to perfectly align your values. And then it'll just take the extra space and put it in between each one. So now if I make this 130 or something like that, there's a little bit less space, but it will still put it evenly in between that. So again, if you have extra space in your grid, meaning that your container is wider than your grid needs to be because you've used a hard pixel value or a rem or m value, not a FR unit or percentages, then you can use justify content to tell it where those items tend to go. Similarly, if your grid has an actual height on it, so now let's get rid of some of these. Let's just bring it down to 10 items. And let's say that in this case, we don't need all these template rows either. Let's get rid of that. There we go. But if our container had a hard height on it, like 500 px, what's going to happen? And by default, these items are stretching, right? You know how stretch is the default, but we can align content. We can say center, and that will center them. We can say start, and that will put them at the top, end, and then similarly space around, we'll put them around, and space between, we'll do that. I don't run into that all that often just because a fixed height on a grid is not as common as a width on a grid, but it's good to know. Again, align is the vertical axis, justify is the horizontal axis. Good. And then finally, we've got these last two, which is align self and justify self. And what that allows us to do is to overwrite each of those on a case-by-case basis rather than a single basis. So let's take item 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take item 5, and this would be on the item itself. And we could just do something like, let's say we wanted to do it along the x-axis. That's justify. So justify self, and we could just say center. Oh, you have to spell it right for it to work. There we go. So you see how all of these are stretch, but I can overwrite it on a case-by-case basis with the ability to justify self. Align self works exactly the same way. If I were to center that, then it's going to pop it down center. And why is that not working? Well, we actually don't have any height on this actual element. But if I did, it would perfectly center itself. So good to put those in your back pocket. I try to think of some sort of silly way to remember that justify is on the X or the row axis, and align is on the Y or the vertical or the column axis. But after a while you tend to remember it, or just bookmark this little page and look at the items there. So we got a bunch more examples coming up on when we can use that. And myself, I actually use this quite a bit just to center text inside of actual elements. And again, if you look back at the style.css, which is our base style, you'll notice that on each of the items, I have just displayed grid, and I haven't given it any columns or rows or anything. But this little ditty right here, where display grid, justify content center, align items center, that's a great way just to take whatever is in an element. It might just be a paragraph tag, might be raw text, might be a couple paragraph tags, and just to perfectly center it without having to really worry about it. You can also do this with Flexbox, but I actually think I prefer to do it in grid just because of the ability to both do justify self and align self, whereas with Flexbox, you can only do align self. There is no justify self in Flexbox, which is a bit of a bummer. Maybe it'll come back in a revision to the Flexbox set, but I'm pretty happy with that. All right, let's move on to the next one. We're almost done our fundamentals, and then we're gonna dive into some real world examples.